I'm just going to say a few words before we get started in English. I'm going to be leaving this evening, so I just wanted to make sure I said a few things before I left. You know, this event, which I hope you all agree is incredibly successful and incredibly valuable. There's a lot of great content here and a lot of excitement, and I think it reinforces the idea that Porto Alegre is the intellectual, activist, free market capital of Brazil. This event was made possible by Roberto. Where's Roberto? Anyway, he's somewhere here, right, by Roberto, and a handful of people who financially supported this. This doesn't happen from selling tickets. This doesn't happen from manna from heaven. This happens because people value this and actually contribute to the cause. And, you know, I think that this is something that should happen every year, and it should grow. And I'm hoping that next year we see a lot more young people, and we bring a lot of students, and we make this not 200, 250 people, but 400, 500, you know, and maybe we can compete with the IEE about the size of the conference and make it a few thousand. But to do that, we need financial support from you guys. So those of you who really value what we're doing here today, really think that this is something that should continue, that this should become an annual event, that this should grow, that the influence of these ideas are crucial to Brazil, to the world, and to Porto Alegre. I encourage you to talk to Roberto and see if there are ways in which you can help, you can support. He's right here. There's a variety of different ways. Here's Roberto. There's a variety of different ways in which you can help us make this possible. And the more people help, the more funds we can raise, the more influential we can be, the bigger the conference we can have, the more scholarships we can have to bring in students. And we can not just maintain this as the intellectual free market capital of Brazil. We can grow this and make Brazil one day maybe the intellectual free market capital of the world. So hopefully anybody who's interested, anybody who sees value in this, trader principle. You remember we talked about the trader principle? Writing checks. Writing checks is good, feels good when you're doing it to further your values. Be selfish. Talk to Roberto. Thank you.
Estão me ouvindo? Aí. Boa tarde. Bom, é um prazer estar participando do evento. Obrigado, Roberto, pelo convite para mediar esse painel. Modéstia à parte, o melhor painel do evento. A gente, enquanto políticos, né, fomos expostos a uma situação interessante nesse painel. É confrontar, já que eu, o Marcel e o Geanluca estamos trabalhando no lado agora da política, dentro da política, confrontar com os intelectuais do objetivismo, uma vez que o objetivismo é muito rígido com a participação política, inclusive prega que não se participe ativamente da política. Como é que a gente traduz, então, aquelas ideias trazidas por Ayn Rand, trazidas na Revolta de Atlas, na Nascente, na filosofia do egoísmo e tudo mais, para dentro da arena política? E eu, particularmente, quando li a Revolta de Atlas a primeira vez, tive uma revolução na minha cabeça, e hoje estou mandatário de um cargo político como vereador em Porto Alegre, e tentando, de alguma forma, replicar aqueles conhecimentos aprendidos, obviamente, com as suas devidas adequações. Então, começo esse painel, deixando livre para que vocês possam interagir conforme quiserem, fazendo a seguinte pergunta: é possível viver uma vida moral numa sociedade imoral? Feel free.
Well, sure. Of course, it's impossible to live a moral life in an immoral society. But let me start by disagreeing with something you described earlier. We're not against politics. Ayn Rand was not against politics. Ayn Rand volunteered on presidential campaigns. She participated in the political process. She wrote a speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964 that he never delivered, but that's his problem, you know, all of our problem. It would have been quite an achievement if he had. She campaigned early in her life for particular political candidates. They all disappointed her. So that has to be said, that she was disappointed in the political process ultimately. But she did not reject the political process. She wrote a lot about politics. She supported certain candidates and rejected others. She supported Nixon in 72. She supported Gerald Ford in 76. She was very active politically in that sense. So, this objectivism is not a philosophy that says either the world is 100% free and perfection, or we're going to go home. We don't do anything, or you can't live a moral life, or whatever. In almost any context, as long as we have some freedoms, you can live a moral life. You can make choices about your own life and how you want to pursue it. You can use your mind. You're constrained, and it's sad that we're constrained. Our options are limited, but within the scope of the options available to us, we can make moral choices and immoral choices. And we can get involved in politics up to a point, and we'll talk about that. I assume you'll ask questions about how we would get into politics. But no, you don't get, morality doesn't go out the window because we don't have our ideal. You still have a life to live. You still want to be happy. You still need to pursue the values necessary for that happiness. You still have a mind. You still need to use that mind. That's what morality means.
Yeah, I was accused of talking way too fast when I speak in Portuguese, so I'm going to be very selfish to train my English, and then I'm going to speak in English as well. What I want to say is basically, to me, like being moral in Brasilia is like following a diet, right? I mean, you have a plan. You go to your nutritionist and you have like with your doctor and you say, you know, I'm only going to eat those much calories for a day and those things and etc. But you're traveling all the time. You have to make some adaptations, right? And the choices that you do when you do eat those things is you try to go as close as you can from your general plan. And to me, that's the point of what I'm doing in Brasilia. I'm sure this is what Marcel is doing as well. And the first thing that came to my mind when I was first invited to go to the team, because I wasn't voted in, I don't think I will be a very popular candidate. Who knows me knows that. What will happen is, the question is not what should I do regarding, let's say I have a goal, right? People that don't work in companies, and this is very important, when you do management, you think you understand something that most radical people don't understand. And I see some radical objectivists doing that. There's a lot of radical libertarians that do that as well. They think that you can only do one thing. So it's a binomial. It's like you are either full libertarian or full objectivist, and you do that in every single piece of your life, or you're not that at all. And that's not reality. When you do management, you know that. Like you want to be the best company in the world, you want to have a greater result in your operations, you're gonna do it by step. You can't do a revolution on things. So the question that I had to be confronted, whether it be morally ethical for me to be in that situation, is I'm not choosing between me being there or not. I'm choosing whether I'm going to replace someone who is less like me in that position. So the question was a choice between someone who will certainly not be as radical as I am. I'm very radical for Brasilia. And as you know, from the kind of nicknames that I got in the press. And the question is, should I replace someone or less someone who believes less on those things than I do? And so that moment was very clear. It was a Christmas Eve, by the way. And I got a call and I had like 4 hours to decide. And I think, yeah, I'm going to do it. Because if I'm not going to do it, someone more socialist will do. Someone that believes more in collectivism. Someone who has less faith on the individual than I do. So the question for me was very easy. It's moral because yes, I'm advancing my own self-interest because I chose to do that. It's my passion, right? I love liberty. I love this kind of things. But at the same time, I'm not compromising them. It's not because I can't do everything that I wish, like a diet. It's not because I'm not eating exactly what my nutritionist told me. I'm not giving up on my diet because of that. So that's kind of the way I think.
I think we're all going to force Felipe to shift into English and continue the panel following in English.
No problem, I can do that.
Okay, let's go. I think it's actually a matter of understanding that being moral or immoral, whether it is in politics or in other activity, it's a decision that one takes. So it's not because I'm in politics that I will become immediately immoral. As Yaron Brook just said in his previous panel too, there are many businessmen that don't understand the value of capitalism or what it is, and there are many people in business life which are immoral as well. So I think it's much more about which principles you have, what do you really value, and how do you behave in this arena, especially because in politics, if you look around, of course, there are many people who are in politics just for their own specific group interests, which are not the interest of, let's say, the individual really. And how do you behave there in order not to give up on your principles, but remembering that you can't fight all fights at the same time in a very short period of time?
I think it's also it's important if you narrow the question from how do you live a moral life in an immoral society, can you get involved in politics without compromising your principles or your moral principles?
That's actually the second question, is
okay.
How you get into politics without compromising those values, ideas.
Yeah, so can I start then?
Yeah,
the second
of course.
question.
Feel free.
I think it's important to hold that to get involved in politics, the only form of getting involved doesn't mean running for office, running for election. It can be to try to really influence the government, people in the government. And that is an important thing to try to do. And I think one should think about models of when this has been done and done successfully, and see the internal debates that they have about this kind of question. I think one of the most interesting ones to look at, because it's a very positive, is the abolition of slavery in 19th century America. So there were many abolitionists who entered the political field, not necessarily to get elected to office, but to have a real impact on how all the legislators, the politicians, and wider the public are thinking about this incredibly important political issue. And what you're trying to do is think, what really are my principles, and then what political action moves towards the goal that I'm trying to set and not taking me backward. And it's very difficult, I think, in concrete situations to figure out which of those two alternatives is happening. And there can be a lot of internal debate in these movements about, this is compromising on our principles versus this is, advancing them, not as far as we want, but it's not taking a step backwards. And the abolitionists had debates about as fundamental as, is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? Because in a certain way it tolerates slavery. So does that make it a pro-slavery document? And should we be against the U.S. Constitution, or should we be for the U.S. Constitution? Now, I agree with the abolitionists who thought, no, it's not essentially a pro-slavery document, and you can be on the side both of the Declaration and of the Constitution, and you don't have to advocate, let's get rid of the U.S. Constitution. But that's a kind of internal debate, and they each accuse the other of betraying these principles. And in the end, you really have to think about, what are my principles, and am I advancing them? And in these difficult situations, in the end, you're the judge to decide, am I really sticking to my principle or not? But I think another lesson to get from the abolitionists, and this is why I think one has to think about political activism as wider than holding political office. The end goal has to be clear and articulated. So the abolitionists, I think you are compromising when you say, no, we're not trying to get rid of slavery. All we want is it not be extended into the new states. So we want to sort of the status quo in regard to slavery. I don't think that is a moral position to hold. And if that's what you start doing politically, I think you've compromised on your principles. So you have to hold, what we're after is the total abolition. Here's a half measure, and this is why I think it's a half measure that's advancing us towards there, but this is what we'll accept for now. And it might be hard in political office to do that, Because if you say my end goal is to abolish slavery, maybe you can't get elected. But that doesn't mean you can't be active politically, even if you can't get elected.
If I can add just one thing to that, it's also a matter of looking at the glass and seeing it half empty or half full, because we talk about compromising our values and principles, but we could also be speaking of influencing other people around to engage in the same principles we have if we are there. If we are not in politics, of course, the chances are higher that, as Geanluca said, that the other ideas will prosper, not ours.
It's kind of funny to hear you saying that, because we have a friend which is actually a politician. He ran in 2016 as city councilor in Florianopolis, another capital in Brazil, in the Socialist Party, and he was libertarian. And sometimes when I met him, I usually say, "You are my favorite socialist." You know? And eventually, he was answering the question, "Why are you running or still in a socialist party?" And he said something very similar to what Geanluca answered now, because if I was not there, a socialist would be there. So,
See, I think that's problematic.
please
Very problematic.
talk to us why.
Because you're legitimizing socialism. You're legitimizing the Socialist Party. If socialism means
He's
something,
not in the Socialist Party anymore.
good. But when he was, you're basically saying socialism is a legitimate idea. I'm a better candidate than this other candidate, but the idea is a legitimate idea. And I think that's wrong.
Well,
and it goes back to what Onkar said. I think you have to say, this is where I'm heading. I'm going to have to compromise on the way there. But as long as I'm moving in that direction, as long as this is my goal, free markets, let's say, right? I'm for laissez-faire capitalism. I'm not going to get there tomorrow, obviously. So here are the steps we're taking in order to get there. Then it's okay. But if you start off, I'm a socialist, I'm just a different kind of socialism, you're legitimizing the concept and a whole set of ideas, and you lose control of the narrative. You lose control of being able to define what that is. So I think that's a huge mistake, and that's why I like the idea of starting new parties, right, where you get to define the terms, right, rather than joining existing parties where the terms are being defined by somebody else.
So somehow it is a judgment of having options, where to go, where to run.
The problem is that in Brazil we have a party cartel. So in order to start your own party, you need almost 1 million signatures, which is crazy. So this is why in this specific case he had to run for the Socialist Party there, because that was the option he had, which was kind of indeed problematic. But he told me, similarly to what Felipe was told, that he'd rather have a liberal in a Socialist Party than a socialist in any other party.
The fact that he's not in the Socialist Party anymore suggests to me that strategy didn't succeed.
Oh, yeah, well, actually, he found a way out, which is very good indeed.
Well, it's better to find a way out in the beginning. But I agree. I mean, the real obstacles in politics, for example, in America, there's a two-party system. It's really hard to start another party, a new party. You know, these are difficulties. And getting involved in politics is not easy. And one of the points is that we can influence politics without getting into politics. You can advocate, you can agitate, you can work for politicians in ways that you don't buy into a whole party agenda that is running there. I mean, my view is as long as you're moving towards more freedom, and that you're clear that your goal is freedom, then there's nothing immoral about it. And yes, you're going to have to make compromises, but the compromises have to move you in the direction of freedom. If you're compromising away from freedom, then you shouldn't be in the game. Then you should be outside of politics agitating. But if you're going to be in politics, you have to move the ball, in a sense, in the direction of more freedom. That should be the single-minded goal that drives you.
Yeah, let me try to create like a disagreement here, because you do legitimize in some way, right? But the thing is, there's going to be a socialist party. And to make my point, let me invoke the great thinker, Caitlyn Jenner, formerly known as Bruce Jenner. And what's the question? So she gets really, like, you know, almost like you can say, prosecuted by the left and by the LGBT movement, etc. How can a transgender be in the Republican Party? And she's very clear about that. She says, you know, how do I make the Republican Party more less conservative and less against individual rights in that very specific arena? And the answer is by being there, by occupying those space, because if I'm not there, it's going to be an anti-transgender person. And that's one way that I think that there's going to be a socialist party. There's always going to be a socialist party as long as we have a democracy. And socialists can change the meaning, right? I mean, what Bernie Sanders is advocating is certainly not the kind of socialism that you see back in the 19th century. So something much more close to what you say the social democracy, etc., which is still bad, but it's not socialism, the full sense of socialism. And the second point that I would like to make is I don't think we can afford anymore not being in politics. You know why? Because everything has become politicized. Everything. I mean, whether I'm using a straw or not to drink is being politicized. The things that I eat is being politicized. If I eat red meat, I'm killing like the environment. If I'm not eating this, I'm like sexist. And the way that we dress got politicized. The way that we speak have been politicized. The way that we write has been politicized. So everything has been politicized. This is so bad. I mean, this is so bad. So right now, I don't see how can we not be involved in politics because everything that we do has been taken by politics.
Yeah, but it wasn't taken by politicians. So the reason everything's being politicized is not because of politicians. Politicians are followers, they're not leaders. They've never been leaders in all the history of mankind. So the reason everything's being politicized is because of intellectuals. Because it was politicized in the universities, it was politicized by intellectuals, and then the politics caught up with the intellectuals. If you want to change that, ultimately, you can try as a politician. I don't think you can be successful. I think at the end of the day, if you're going to change that aspect of it, the politicization of everything, it can only be done as an intellectual battle. You know, you can outlaw straw, you can legitimize straws for your 4 years. But if at the universities they continue teaching the same environmental garbage, which they will, because you haven't changed anything at the universities, then the next 4 years they're going to ban straws in the next administration. To do sustained long-term change, there has to be an intellectual change in the culture. And that happens not top-down, but university-down, right? So the real battle is an intellectual battle. Now I agree, I'm not against getting involved in politics, because sometimes things are so bad that you got to fight, you got to do what you can to move us towards freedom, to buy it, if only to buy us time, so that us intellectuals, who are the really important ones, right, can have more time to do the work to change the culture. So I'm not against going into government to slow it down, to move maybe in a positive direction for a while, but the long-term sustained change has to come from the people, I think, who are the real, who now are the real enemy, and we need to replace, not convert, but replace into good guys. We need to replace the intellectuals with pro-individualist intellectuals. Otherwise, we lose.
Let me play the politician here because I agree with both. Actually, it starts on the intellectual realm, of course, with culture, but the consequence is acting, is participating in politics too. So, of course, I advocate for political participation, but this is why I think it's so important to have books, to have people reading. All these institutions that have been built in Brazil in the last decades, actually, were responsible for this moment we're living right now in our country, with many politicians, well, not so many, but at least some, which are really they really have this ideals of liberty and reducing the size of government. And this is very important to state, because the state has grown bigger and bigger and bigger, and has been so much in our life has been politicized in the last times because we were not there, because others were there. So it's actually a consequence, participating in politics, from what we have in the intellectual realm and in the culture of the society as a whole, let's say.
I think the environmental movement, you're bringing up the plastic straws and that kind of thing, is an interesting case. So just as thinking about the abolitionist movement, is an interesting positive case. Now, I'll just put it on the record. I don't know if we're going to talk about it now, but I think environmentalism is 100% wrong and actually a very evil movement. But if you look how it gained political significance, it starts in the universities, but it's not universities to elected officials. It's universities to all kinds of think tanks and what they call NGOs now, advocating all kinds of environmental regulation and policies. And this is the sense, I think, in which politicians are followers. It's not they're directly, what's the latest class at Harvard and so on, but it's through this kind of mechanism. It comes from the universities into all these kinds of organizations that then have an impact on the politicians and the media. So I think it's again, to be politically active. I don't think environmentalism has won or has gained such power politically because it had so many political candidates. It's because it had all these kinds of organizations. And even when, like, an Al Gore in the US, who's probably the most of recent candidates, the most on the environmentalist side, he's also the inventor of the internet, he didn't win, but still these ideas get injected into the government. And I think that's part to think why these ideas are getting injected into the government.
Let me very quickly disagree to one thing that was generalized here by Yaron, that all politicians are followers. I disagree. I think that most of them really are, and flip-flops, as you say, right? Because they are paying attention more to what the public thinks than what really their principles are, what they should really do. But there are some that really are leaders, and that entails also sometimes knowing when is the right time to say some things, of course, but there are some politicians who are leaders who in their times can put forward some reforms necessary when everybody else say, you're doing something that is not for the good of society because they think this is good for society because of populistic or demagoguery. But if you look at as a whole, then I should agree with Yaron that most politicians are really followers, but not all of them, I would say, as in other walks of life as well.
Hélio Beltrão, which is president of the Mises Institute in Brazil, once said, and I think it's a very appropriated sentence or figure of speaking in this context, that he sees the liberal movement just like a football team. You have the intellectuals as goalkeepers. You have the NGOs, the institute, the think tanks as, I don't know, maybe the defense system, and you have the society as midfielders, sorry, and the politicians as the forwarders.
I'm a right wing. I'm on the right wing running down the thing. I'm no goalkeeper. What are you talking about? Goalkeepers. Man, that's terrible. Other way around, I think the politicians are the goalkeepers. We're the strikers. I mean, there's certainly a division of labor, and that's the point. There's no question there's a division of labor across all of those involved if we're all fighting for the same thing. And we're not always all fighting for the same thing. Unfortunately, we often fight against each other. But if we're fighting for the same thing, then yes, there's a division of labor, and there's kind of philosophical work that needs to be done in academia and other places.
Would you be happy to be the coach?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Really like to be the coach.
Right,
but I want to be the striker. I want to score goals. I mean, give me a break. I mean, that's much more fun. And I was when I played football, I was on the right wing. So, running down the right wing, I love that. That's fun. But as compared to you guys, I'm an amateur. You guys know how to play football. This is Brazil, after all. There is a huge division of labor. So you've got the intellectuals at the universities. Then you've got a whole other string of intellectuals at think tanks and institutions. Then you've got business leaders who, we can talk about the role of business people in politics. I think it's way underrated, and I think you underrate yourself. And you guys need to get much more active and much more involved, because the world won't change until you get involved, business people. And then you've got people who are interested in political activism, who take the ideas of the think tank and the intellectuals and apply them to concrete issues. And then you've got people all the way who actually are going to go into politics and make change, right? And you need all of that. You can't do it, none of those work by themselves. All of that needs to work, and all of that needs to be focused on a single goal. And in politics, that single goal is freedom. It's the freedom of the individual. It's to limit government to its proper role. And as long as that's all working consistently towards that, then it's a beautiful thing. Let me just say about leaders. I mean, even the greatest leaders, there's kind of an interplay, right? They can't really get elected unless there's already a base of support. What they can do when a politician is a good leader, whether it's on the left or on the right, but when they project, is they can increase that base of support. They can educate people about the ideas. I mean, certainly somebody like Lincoln in America did that over the issue of slavery. To some extent, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher did that with regard to free markets. They couldn't have gotten elected if there wasn't a base already of support. And then once they got elected, they expanded that base through their rhetoric, through using the bully pulpit, through speaking and giving speeches, and action. So I think there's an interchange, and that's the best politicians. But they have to still rely on a certain base of followers, of people who are going to support them in the beginning.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right when you say that it starts in universities, start with the ideas, and that explains why we're doing something right, and Argentina is never doing something right. You know, I was just having this discussion with a Wall Street Journal writer. It's this: Argentina keeps going for the same circles. It's always the same politics. It's price control, is trying to meddling in the exchange rate, is trying to prohibit dollar purchase, and it's always the same politics. It's like they don't evolve, and that happens because they didn't have Winston Ling, they didn't have Mr. Rashevsky here to start creating those ideas. And then they go for us and they ask, well, why Marcel, Felipe, and me all went to Georgetown? It's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's kind of, we created an environment for ideas, for the discussions, for the institutions, and etc. And what you're doing now when you're seeing those two guys into politics is the result of the ideas. Maybe it didn't start in universities here because it started those amazing institutes that were created 30 years ago, but it was the ideas that created the baseline, that created the possibility that you could construct something. And when I go to the Congress in Brasilia, I don't know if Marcel has the same impression, I feel like there's a lot of people with good intentions, but there's a huge void when it comes to getting some content so they can use. So you have these new parties, you know, the main party now that supports the president is PSL, which is the president's party, right? And they have great intentions. I mean, they do have great intentions, but they do not have a construction of content for public policy. I'm not talking intellectually, like Olavo de Carvalho would say. I'm talking more content of public policies, like the left does, right? So the left, when I sit with them, they can basically come up with 30 different arguments for having the wrong idea, right? And we have, when you do have those phenomenons that go for politics, as the new conservative movement got in Brazil, because I separate the conservative movement from the classic liberal movement, the new conservative movement lacks this intellectual support on public policy ideas. This is why we liberals have been key partners of them on this so far, because we have an agenda when it comes to economic issues, very strongly dedicated. Unlike Argentinians, we learned with our mistakes. We did price controls in the 80s, didn't work. No one is advocating for that, not even the left. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons why we're there.
So that explains why Roberto Campos, by the time that he was there, he got a loan and maybe went further.
He was a socialist when he was there. We have to say this. Roberto, I'm not saying like full socialist, but Bob Fields, as his nickname, yeah. Right? He was a socialist at first. He was responsible for the creation of our National Development Bank. Do you remember that? It was his idea. He was a partner with Celso Furtado. I don't have to say anything else after that. But he changed during politics and then he became a leader, even though he was there. And when he died, it said during the discussions of the 1988 Constitution, he would say to his colleagues, like, you know, if I had read Hayek from the very beginning, I have changed my entire career. But it's kind of like this, you know, you have you must have leaders there because it takes a lot of courage. There's resistance in politics, and there's resistance in the bureaucracy. It's very different, okay? It's very different. I thought before I went to Brasilia that would be similar, but what I discovered is that the resistance of doing something in the government is much higher than during Congress. When I was in discussions for the Economic Freedom Bill in Congress, the resistance was shockingly less than inside the government. Because inside the government was not ideological. There's this general asceticism against new things, right? And there is this general idea of maintaining power and knowledge. And this is very, very hard. I mean, they call me crazy, they call us like the worst things ever, because they're just so used to an idea. And it's very similar when you do organization transformations in big companies, like I used to do in my last job, right? You want to change a company that's going bankrupt, you have to change the way that they handle. It's the same thing inside the government.
All right, and what Atlas Shrugged can teach politicians about how to deal with moochers and looters on our society?
I'm going to switch the question a little bit.
Yeah, feel free.
Because not just politicians, what it can teach better people,
right?
Which can include politicians, but it can include the whole population, including business. Yaron brought this up a little bit, and I think this is a really, really crucial lesson to learn from Atlas Shrugged, and it's one of the things that Ayn Rand advocated in terms of political activism. When you look at positive change in, again, my context is largely America, in the United States, of people fighting for their rights and for their freedom, it requires the victims to stand up and say, we will no longer be victims. We demand our freedom and we demand our rights. You saw that with the abolition of slavery. It's crucial that you had former slaves saying that this condition is intolerable and we demand freedom. In the women's rights movement and to get the vote, it's again, you needed women saying, we're being discriminated against, we do not accept this status as second-class citizens, we want our rights. And you had this with the civil rights movement, which is the most well-known, of when you have the segregation laws and so on, even after the abolition of slavery in the United States. And it required the people being discriminated against to stand up and demand their rights. With the gay movement later, which is a type of civil rights, you needed this again. And it's tremendously difficult for the first people to stand up and say, look, we don't accept this discrimination anymore. We don't accept this second-class citizen status anymore. And one of the lessons of Atlas Shrugged is you need business people to do that. You need business people to say, we're being discriminated against. Our rights are being denied to us. You impose all these regulations on us as though we're criminals. And you have to really exhibit what these regulations do to businesses and so on. And when I talk to business people, because there's no such thing like this, it's completely understandable that, look, if we do this, the regulatory agencies and so on are going to descend upon us and make life miserable for us. That was true for people trying to abolish slavery. It was true for the civil rights movement. It was true for women advocating for the vote. It was true for gay rights. When you do it at the start, you're going to have a tremendous backlash, and it's not going to be pleasant. But I don't think there's any possibility of getting real economic freedom without that happening. And one of the things Ayn Rand advocated is that businessmen should form an organization for their civil rights in the same way that these other groups who are being discriminated against did. I mean, she has an article, America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. And until businessmen start saying, yes, we are a persecuted minority, I don't think you can get any long-term change.
I wrote a chapter for one of those books of the IE, Liberty Forum series, I think it was 2015, and the title of the chapter was How Ayn Rand Made Me Give Up on Politics and Why Ayn Rand Made Me Reconsider Returning to It. And this was because in 2010, after the second time I tried to become a state representative, And I needed about 35,000 votes in our system. I got 14,000, was a good result, but far away from what was necessary. And I was city councilor before, but still, I don't have parents in politics. I'm not from a politician's family and so on, or have been working in politics just for the sake of it, like many other politicians do in Brazil, to become elected afterwards, and I did not have any interest in that. And then I read Atlas Shrugged. That was in 2010, end of 2010, after the second time I tried to become a state representative. And after I read Atlas Shrugged, I was like, this is, I've had enough. This is not for me. I don't like politics. What am I doing in politics after all? This, it's just not my environment. Because that's what you feel as, when you're reading a book like Atlas Shrugged. However, in 2013, when Brazil changed, and it changed a lot, of course, it doesn't happen from one time to the other, but all these mass movements, people taking to the streets and saying that, we don't want stadiums, football stadiums that are FIFA quality. We want FIFA quality for our public services. And people, take to the streets, and I saw, we have to make a difference ourselves. If we have achieved this situation now, this very bad and poor situation in the country, is because we have not been doing enough. And it's in our own interest to do this if we want to change things in society and therefore also in politics. So this is why I decided to return afterwards to politics. And, I almost won a state representative, but I took office, and now I'm in Brasilia as a federal representative. So in the end, it all goes back also to our self-interest, what we feel good in doing, and how we can do things to change what is wrong.
So one thing I think Atlas Shrugged could teach politicians about what to do is to be leaders, right? To go back to the question of, can a politician be a leader? But to be a leader, and what that means. And I think what it means to be a leader, if you're advocating for free markets, and that's the implicit assumption here, that's where we're heading, is to not just be buried in a room writing laws and negotiating and doing all that, but to become a spokesman for these ideas, to use the bully pulpit, to use the platform that politics gives you, to make the moral case for freedom, to make the moral case for capitalism, not in the great detail maybe that we made here, but to infuse the message with the morality of individualism, to talk about the benefits that freedom has to individual Brazilians and the impact it has on their lives. And one of the things they can do is get away from the collectivization of economics and politics. So much of our language that politicians talked about is the language of collectivism. It's the language of the other guy. It's the language of the public good and the common good without defining anything, right? This vague, amorphous, socialist concepts. I think a real contribution politicians can have is in changing the way we think about these ideas, changing the terms of debate, changing the way the public views these. And this requires leadership. This requires political/intellectual leadership. But you've got, one of the great things you've got as politicians is a stage. People are listening. The press hates you. Well, let them hate you for good reason, right? Make the kind of argument they've never heard before on why these things, not just it's going to improve GDP a little bit here and there, but why this is morally right, why this is good for individual Brazilians, why their liberty will be enhanced. I think that could go such a long way in terms of leadership, in terms of moving the country in the direction you want to go, beyond just the policies that you might advocate for that are going to be good.
Can I just give an example? I think what's the closest to Atlas Shrugged that we have seen in Brazil? I mean, let's for a moment deviate and think, how could you do that in Brazil? I think if you just decide, okay, I'm going to close my business and I'm going to go to another location, the first thing that will happen in Brazil is the labor justice will not let you, because it's illegal to close such a big business in Brazil. I don't know if you know that. You can't just fire people. So the closest thing that I've seen in Brazil, and I know that it gets a lot of prejudice when I mention it, but Mr. Luciano Wang, he has doing something very interesting. So what he decided to do is said, and he can do that because he's a big entrepreneur, and when you are big, you have more protections than you're not. We have to be very considerative of that. But he has decided to face it. So what he does is he goes to city councils and he shows the bureaucracy paper and he says, you know, your city mayor, your bureaucracy is delaying 6 months the opening of my store. It's 500 jobs. These people are responsible for 500 people unemployed for 6 months because of those excruciating regulations that they never take a look. So he's doing something that he's doing this for the first time that I've seen in Brazil, which is to face the bureaucrats and saying, you are responsible for it. You are responsible for it. You don't care about the people unemployed. You care about the regulation. You don't see the intent of it. You don't see the consequences of that. It's kind of why Thomas Sowell decided not to be a Marxist anymore. He always says that. He went to the Labor Department in America, and he saw that people were not interested on raising employment rates. They were more interested on doing their work. So he has revolted against their system without entering politics. Of course that he's supporting politics, but it's a very courageous kind of step that not a lot of those can do. Because otherwise you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be, you're going to sued. In Brazil, you can be very easily be sued. All of you know that. So that's kind of the closest example of Atlas Shrugged that I've seen in Brazil.
Right, thank you very much. So now we're going to be open for questions of the audience. Feel free to make your questions either in Portuguese or in English. Então, obrigado por enquanto. Quem quiser fazer perguntas, estamos abertos a perguntas da plateia. Podem fazê-las em português ou em inglês. Fiquem à vontade. Don't be hurried.
It's a shy audience. I don't know what.
Microphone.
Okay, it's an interesting debate between the thinkers and the makers. And I think that's the point. When we get there, and you got there, and you have our total admiration of being there, because it's a pain in the ass to be there. Sorry, my French. But I think this is a big difference. And how do we make dreams of a free society into reality in a totally unreal society as ours? So my question is, what's the next step that you can do in Brasilia to move the idea closer to reality?
Well, there's a new fight every day, as I see in Brasilia at least, and Ricardo is also here, Felipe in the city council, and so on. So when you're discussing regulation or new bills in parliament, is the one they want to impose again free luggage in airplanes, right? So today in Brazil, you pay for your luggage if you want to bring your luggage with you. If you don't, you don't pay.
Same in America.
Same in America, same in Europe. But there was a bill approved recently that the companies now are obliged again to carry your luggage free of charge. Of course, there's no free luggage, but there were some representatives that were going to the Tribune and saying this is good for the consumer, and say no, this is very bad because you're making me pay for your luggage. So you have also to start telling those people in Parliament that they are actually going against poor people. They are going against the consumer and not the other way around. And this is something that you have to do every day, Ricardo. I know, as you said, part of my French, but you have to be patient. You have to, talk a lot. You have to convince people. But this is the only way it goes in politics. If we want to bring some change, we have to remember that it's not something that we're going to resolve in the short term, not at all.
Yeah, I think the next step, and then for us, is to start moving those think tanks to Brasilia. Because there's not one liberal objectivist think tanks there. And I think we're getting to that phase, right? Because it's very new to have liberals in Brasilia, like classic liberals, like identify ourselves. It's new for Brasilia. It's completely new. I mean, they don't know what to do with us. It's just such a break of paradigm. And so now that we're there...
Same with us. We're just 8 of Novo Party in 513. 8. federal representatives, and we're doing such a noise. Nobody knows where it's coming from.
So now we have to plant seeds there. So it's like a war, you know. We go advancing territories. So I think that the next step is start to bring those structures that we have in Porto Alegre, we have in Rio de Janeiro, we have in São Paulo, but none of those are as good as here. But that's, you know, we're better. I'm just joking, guys. We need to move those structures close to power, because politics is location, location, location. And this is so serious. This is so serious. If you're an assistant to the right representative, the right congressman, maybe you have more power of influence than 5 representatives. If you're a friend of the Speaker of the House, or of the Senate's president, or of the leader of a big party that has a lot of influence, an intellectual friend, or even a professor that's close to him, you can destroy or control a series of things just by giving them ideas. The biggest opposition to our bill was not ideological opposition, was a professor, I'm not going to mention his name, but that didn't believe on it. And he was very close to a lot of powerful people. And they would constantly tell those people, you know, this is not good, this is not good, this is not good. And almost killed it. Almost killed it. Not because of ideological ideas, not because of political power, but because he was in the right location. So I think that the next step for us is trying to move those things to Brazil. Can you imagine an Objectivist Institute in Brasilia? That would be crazy, man. That would be crazy. But I think that's the next step.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say there was an implication in what you said that there's a conflict here. I mean, I think it's great that there are politicians that are advocating for liberty and freedom. I think they're incredibly courageous. I don't envy them. You know, the struggles and the challenges that they're facing. I agree that you want to move the intellectuals closer to the center of power, because I think those intellectuals can have huge amount of influence over power. I also think power can corrupt the intellectuals, so you have to be a little careful. But hopefully it doesn't. I think we should support that. I'm very positive about seeing people who really believe in these ideas getting involved in politics in Brazil. There's a danger. And as long as everybody recognizes the danger, and as long as everybody is aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it, I think there's a lot of upside. There's also downside. We just have to recognize that. The downside is sanctioning really bad stuff, right? Giving legitimacy to the really bad stuff. And as long as you're aware of that, as long as you're conscious of it, and you're acting not to do it to the extent that you can, then I think these are all positive things.
You have to keep your sanity.
And you have to keep your sanity, and you have to realize when you're compromising and what you're compromising on, and where your line in the sand is, and what are things that you're not willing to compromise. And the focus needs to be on always moving towards liberty. Even if the move is just a little, it has to be a move towards more freedom.
It's not a question, it's a commentary, it's a critic, actually, about exactly that. It's about over-compromising. You are from Partido Novo, and I was a member, or not a member anymore. I never participated in any meeting, just sent the money, and I stopped sending. I think you are over-compromising. I hope I misunderstood, but it seems to me that you're talking about good socialists, and very concerned about this kind of thing. I think people like Bernie Sanders are very dangerous, because they teach people in universities, they teach people that are going to teach our kids, they influence people that are going to be in the press, that they are in the press right now, and that's why the press is a problem. Not that the concept of free press is a problem, but the ideas in the press might be a problem, because they criticize the individualism, for example. That's bad in general in the press. These good socialists influence the people they're going to rule us, the politicians, and it's extremely dangerous, extremely bad. I feel like this is a movement growing even in the United States. that should be the beacon of enlightenment and freedom for the rest of the planet. And now I think it's in danger. Also in Europe, more and more, these ideas are growing. And I think you guys over-compromise.
I don't know who said about good socialists.
Maybe I misunderstood. I think you have friends that in the Socialist Party...
No, he's a liberal. He's in a socialist party. He's not a good socialist. He's a liberal.
Yeah,
It's
I don't know
different.
how that works.
I mean, I think you're referring to a comment, which, and I agree with
It's
you.
because of the, the political system in Brazil that you know, and he's not in the socialist party anymore. And I can fully advocate for him as a very good liberal. He's even better than many people that claim to be liberal. Bruno Souza is, if you look at what he's done as a city council in Florianopolis, he's been better than many other city councils that say they're liberal and they're not that much.
Okay. Well, just to conclude, may I? Okay.
So hi, good afternoon. My question is, where do you draw the line? We all know we are in legislative bodies, and we know you end up voting for the regulation of Uber services. It was forbidden, now it's legal. You end up voting to make it legal, but in the same bill that makes it legal, you end up over-regulating it, and that's part of the job of a politician. You end up putting up with a lot of BS so that you can move forward, liberty forward just a little bit. My question is, where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? And after all, in a day-by-day business of politics, how do you define what is acceptable and may be compromised, and what is not acceptable and cannot be compromised in moving liberty forward? I mean, we are all, as you said, Yaron, we are all in the business of pushing liberty forward, but in doing that, you always need to compromise just a little bit. So, do you have any suggestion of how to draw the line of what is or is not compromisable? Thank you.
So I don't know the details about the regulations that were imposed on Uber here for them to be able to enter the market, but I would say the way to think about that kind of issue is precisely from the perspective of freedom. So is it better that the government bans Uber and no one can use the service, or it's allowed in and it has some regulations imposed on it? And then I would think normally the second is better, but I would put at least two conditions on it. If I were in politics and voting for this, I would say the best policy would have been just to let Uber come in and operate, not impose these restrictions. But it's better to have it here with these restrictions and regulations than not at all, and really be crystal clear on that point. But the second thing to think is, what are the regulations that are being imposed? And that's why I started with, I don't know the details here of what. Because if you think the regulations are so crippling that Uber won't be able to operate and maybe in a year or two leaves the market and say, well, I mean, we can't come anywhere. I mean, Uber doesn't make a profit, but let's say they made a profit and they decided, no, we can't here with these regulations. What people often, the lesson they'll draw with that is, look at the failure of business and freedom, and we tried to have this privatized, and we need to go back to taxis and licenses, and it's all government operated. And if that's what you think the regulations are going to do, then I wouldn't advocate for it, because then I think it is you're moving away from freedom rather than towards it.
I mean, I'd agree with that. Use the opportunity to educate. Again, be a leader. To say, I'm voting for this under protest. Because it's moving us, but really we should have no regulation on Uber. And then, you know, there are a lot of examples where sometimes it's better not to do it and to let people suffer, in a sense, because the alternative is much more damaging. And where that line is, there's no magic to that. That's what makes your job difficult, right? Is to figure out what is advancing liberty and what isn't advancing liberty. And that's complicated. That's not easy. And you're going to make mistakes. That's the other thing. They're going to make mistakes about that. But this principle is, are we advancing liberty? Sometimes we'll get it wrong, but generally that's what we're trying to do. And are we speaking the language of liberty? That is, are we consistently advocates for freedom, even if it'll cost us politically? Right? Even if it'll cost us politically, you have to say, I'm deregulating, you know, I'm allowing this, but my goal is there. I mean, I'll give you an example. Example from the United States, because I don't know enough about Brazil to give a Brazilian example. But 100 years ago, the left in the United States decided that what they wanted was government-run healthcare. They wanted the government to run healthcare. And they knew they couldn't get that all at once, and they would have to compromise. And they would have to move a little bit and take over piece by piece by piece. But they always said, what we want ultimately is to take over healthcare. In the meantime, we'll just do it for poor people. Or we'll just do it for old people. Medicaid, Medicare in the United States, one for poor one. And slowly, like before Obamacare, they had 50% of the healthcare market under government control in the United States, and they said, now we're going to do Obamacare. But what we want is socialized medicine, but we're going to do Obamacare, so we'll take out 70%. And then one day we'll wake up, and in the United States, we'll have 100% government control. And the left always told us that was their goal. Now, flip that on the right. Think about Republicans. What do Republicans want with healthcare? Just, we want to keep Medicare. We want to keep Medicaid. We just want a little bit more freedom. A little bit. We don't have an end goal. Imagine if Republicans said, for 100 years now, said, what we want is 100% private health care. We want to do away with Medicare. We want to do away with Medicaid. We believe private markets should apply to the poor and to the old and to everybody. And yes, we're willing to compromise right now because we know we can't get all of that, so we're willing to move the ball a little bit in that direction, but this is the goal. The debate would be completely different. Completely different. The left would not have won. But you see, you grant them the moral high ground by not challenging their fundamental beliefs, by not challenging their ultimate outcome, and by not presenting a vision. One of the things that the free market doesn't do is present a vision of what the world looks like if we win. We want, I mean, my argument in the United States, we want 100% private health care in the United States. And by the way, that is so exciting. Because you'll get innovation, and you'll get competition, and you'll get cures for diseases, and we'll live to be 200 and whatever. You know, you think you've got good health care today. Health care is going to be 1,000 times, and you can concretize that and show examples of that and everything. But you've got to present a vision, an idea of where you're heading. And the same with everything. Yes, I'm voting for Uber because it's better to have Uber with regulation. But what I really believe is no regulation of Uber, and no regulation of taxis. I want the taxis to compete with Uber. I want to get rid of the state involvement in this transportation stuff because ultimately I can imagine, a world in which you can get this transportation and it's really, really, really cheap and it's really effective and it's consumer driven and all the stuff that we believe in. But project that image as a beautiful thing. The left is so good at generating what they believe is beautiful image of the future, which we know is a nightmare. Really evil. But we need to do the same. We need to define what our ideals are and describe them and then move in that direction and make it clear. This is the leadership in education. Make it clear that there is an ideal that we're moving towards. Not just we're fighting this little battle and we won this little battle and we're happy. No, this is one battle and a series of battles and this is where we're going. People want to know where you're going. And it'll cost you in the short run. It cost the left in the short run. A lot of people said, oh, you want socialized medicine? We're not going to vote for that. But they won the battle slowly, and they won them over time, and you didn't even realize you were giving up all your freedoms. And one day you wake up in America, and it's a completely statist country. And the only way we're going to win the battle in the reverse is to do, in a sense, the same. Present a vision, and then move in that direction through smaller steps.
Oh, very good question, excellent question. Most of you know who Ricardo is. He's also a city councilor, so coming from him, from a politician as well, is just an example of how for him and for us is very difficult sometimes there's no magic, as you said. Let's put it very simply this way. However, what I normally do is to be very transparent about every vote and every step I take. So I think this is key. transparent with the voters, transparent with society as a whole, transparent with those who are also in Parliament, my fellow members of Parliament, because if they know, it pays off in the long run. Sometimes very difficult. There's one representative I met 2 days ago, and I asked a signature for a bill that we are proposing, and we need 171 signatures in order for it to start to have value, really. And he signed for me, but he said, you know, Novo never signed one proposal, a single proposal that I made. And I said, I'm sorry. But actually, all the proposals he made were bad. And we have a very strict policy of not signing proposals that go the wrong direction, right? But he knew it, and he saw, and I explained very transparently what our proposal was, and he said, okay, your proposal is good, I'm signing. So it pays off in the long run. Some would just say, I'm not signing, and it does happen as well, because Novo never signed for us. Well, what can we do? Nothing. We have to keep on explaining, telling what our positions are, what are our principles, and this is the best way to move forward, always in the right direction, being very transparent with everybody.
Any further comments? So we have time. Roberto?
One more question.
Yeah, the last question.
When Onkar and Yaron will be moving into Brazil?
Good one.
When we're invited. You know, you want to set up a think tank in Brasilia, you know, it's just a matter of the invitation and the money.
Great.
I'm happy. We are happy to do what we can to make Brazil the future beacon of liberty for the world. That would be fantastic.
I'm sorry, Roberto. I'm sorry. I thought Roberto was going to ask when were they going to move into politics.
People ask me all the time, why don't you run for president of the United States, right? And I have two things I say. One is I wasn't born there, so I can't run, so that's my excuse kind of to get out of it. But the second is I would lose in a landslide. I mean, 5 people would vote for me in the entire country, maybe 25. I mean, I am too radical to win a political office. That's just the reality. I can't keep my mouth shut. You've noticed that, I guess. I say it like it is, and people might agree with me on this, on one thing, but almost nobody agrees with me on everything. And it would be embarrassing, because I'd lose in such a landslide. And today, politics is so expensive in the United States that I just think there's better uses for that money. I mean, if somebody's willing to bankroll my candidacy, I'm saying this publicly, right, for the governor of Puerto Rico, I live in Puerto Rico, what can I do? Then I would do it if they're willing to bring the checkbook. I would have fun on a debate panel, debating politics with that would be fun. I'd still lose. There's no question I would lose. I don't want to create any false hope. The world is not ready for Yaron Brook in politics.